come on over here for a second and tell our audience where they can obtain your music.
Bandcamp, iTunes, Amazon Music, Spotify, everywhere.
All under the name?
Steve Utley.
And the recent album is called?
Break Free.
How many numbers are on that album?
13 songs.
What did I say, numbers?
Yes.
13 songs. You don't want to say numbers in a rock world. Never. All right, you guys, we've been talking about Calvinism, and we stopped on the subject of God's sovereignty. If you want to understand Calvinism well, you have to understand sovereignty. It's a word that John Calvin used, that was used toward kings and government, people in government. He used to describe God, and it means that it's the teaching that his will is done always, and it's to the exclusion of anything men or women say or do along the way. In the doctrine of predestination, 5-point Calvinism affirms God's sovereignty in predestination and states that it is his perfect will, which is unaffected by what people do or say. It's God's perfect will who decides who will be saved and who will burn eternally in a literal fire of hell. Now, I can't really say this clear enough. It's skirted around today by Calvinists, but in the end, if they're sitting around at lunch together, they all will admit that what it really means is that God, from before the creation of this world and the people on it, has determined who he will save. That's his sovereign will. And the rest he has determined not to even know. They will burn forever, literally in hell, because he has deemed it such. That's known as double predestination. One, there's a group predestined to heaven, and two, there's a group predestined to hell, forever flaming fires. I make that qualifier when we talk about hell, just to let you understand how it's thought of by Calvinists. And so that's a double predestination. So because it kind of sours the palate of Calvinists today, there tends to be a massaging of this stance. It's not as, it's danced around a little bit for people. But I want you to hear what R.C. Sproul says. He recently passed, and he's a great guy, and I don't know him personally, but I love his teachings, and he's a 5-point Calvinist, but he's a very smart man, and this is what he said, quote, "Our final destination, heaven or hell, is decided by God, not only before we get here, but before we were even born." I mean, I'm going to go on and read it, but that's an amazing quote. Decided by God. Not laid out and planned in accordance with everything. None of that stuff. It was decided that my neighbor, Fred, is going to go to heaven and that I am going to go to hell. And there is no changing that in this life. Okay? He goes on and says, it teaches that our ultimate destiny is in the hands of God. Another way of saying this is, from all eternity before we ever live, God decided to save some members of the human race and to let the rest of the human race perish. He goes on and says, God made a choice. He chose some individuals to be saved into everlasting blessedness in heaven, and others he chose to pass over, to allow them to follow the consequences of their sins into eternal torment in hell. Okay? Now, by the way, that's in R.C. Sproul's Chosen by God, Know God's Perfect Plan for His Glory of His Children. Now, in response to this teaching, it's obvious that the people who love and adopt it are never the ones who are going to hell. If you think about that. People who love and adore these teachings are people who think God has elected them. You don't hear anybody who believes this teaching who says it's so great and he's elected me and my family to burn in hell forever. What a wonderful plan. It's always promoted by the people who believe they're the elect. Now, in light of the command to love, and John saying that God is love, and that we are commanded to love 7 times 70, forgive 7 times 70, which means endlessly, and go the extra mile, and love never fails, and all those things that we say, this concept is really difficult for me to understand. I can't for the life of me understand anyone who would be comfortable with the notion that while they may have been chosen to be elect by God, and maybe their wife and maybe their kids, that trillions of other people are going to actually, by His good pleasure, even if their worst sin in life was they stole a cigarette, they swore, and let's say they're just innately kind of selfish like all humans are. That's what they did. But they were good husbands and fathers. They took care of their children. They paid their taxes. They're burning in hell forever and ever, along with everybody else who God doesn't elect. What seems to truly comfort those who maintain the 5-point mindset is the fact that since God elected them, their ability to muck up His election, meaning their ability to blow it, is impossible because He's elected them, so they can't mess it up at all. And from the biblical point of view, we might understand part of the Calvinist attitude as believers do, trust in God's ability to see us through to the end. It is His strength that does bring us through to the end. It is His sovereignty that does see us through to glory. So we got to think about that. But just remember, in Calvinism, there's no such thing as free will. In 5-point Calvinism, which last week we said is the tulip: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. There's no such thing as free will. God not only manages everything and has managed everything from the beginning, He micromanages the details to bring about His will because He's sovereign. Being sovereign, to me, He's the master of puppets, to borrow a phrase. He puppeteers everything. There's no free will, and then His will is played out. To the Calvinists, His management is by and through a cut and dry, black and white decisions because He's sovereign. Now, why our good God, just think about this, why a good, loving God would choose to only elect some and then put the rest in eternal, literal suffering forever, why wouldn't He choose to elect most? Choose to elect almost all, except for maybe Nero. I mean, or Hitler, or Mussolini. There's a few. Why would He only elect some? And remember, it's not that those some did anything good. It's not that they were more righteous. It's not that they had done anything better than anybody else or worse. He just elected the some. And if you ask a Calvinist that, they say it just shows His glory in being merciful to the few and His judgment on the others, and His judgment on the others makes His mercy on the few more magnificent. I don't understand why a sovereign God who is love, who created us, and before He created us, wouldn't say, I'm going to redeem all of them. I'm just going to bring them all around. And why that wouldn't be His attitude. Now, before we wrap it up, the opposite, as we said last week, or sort of an opposite, the main other player to 5-point Calvinism is Arminianism. And they downplay the sovereignty of God, which I think is a mistake to some extent, and they make free will a major factor in the salvation of a human being. And what I mean by that is man's decision to choose well is triumphant to the will of God to want to redeem. And what I mean by that is theologians call the Arminianist approach to salvation synergistic salvation. And what that means is that God is working with the free will of man to bring about salvation. God is working with the free will of man. But so Calvinism would therefore be seen as monergistic, one God, monergistic, doing it, meaning all decisions are from a single direction, from God to man, but the Arminius is synergistic. There are more than one involved in the redemption or the salvation of man. The problem with Arminianism is this. They say God would love to save everybody. He would love to bring everybody around, but free will doesn't allow him to. And so what that winds up being is saying men and women and children and teenagers and their will beats God's desires. So that doesn't make much sense either, does it? On the one hand, you have Calvinism says he elects and that's it, no choice, nothing else, and that's boom, done, the rest going to hell. And the Arminius says, well, he really, really wants to do good, but because he's given man free will, he can't force them to choose, and so therefore man's free will trumps God's sovereignty. So to me, Arminianism is just as bad as Calvinism. Because Calvinism has a despotic God who doesn't care about most, and Arminianism has a weak God because he doesn't get to have his will. So the question is it possible for a loving God to allow for free will, for a loving God to allow people to choose him or not, and for that loving God also to be sovereign, where he in the end will have his way and nobody gets to beat what he wants, which will be the reconciliation of everybody to different places according to their free choices. That way his sovereign will is met to love and reconcile all, no matter how stupid they are. But man's free will is also into play in accordance to what they will receive according to what they sowed in this life. We're going to talk more about that next week. Out.